Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you, particularly those of you who are returning to us. You'll remember that immediately in the aftermath of the G7 in Cornwall in the summer, which seems a very long time ago now, we convened a panel of international experts to ask whether that G7 had given the UK, given the world, momentum towards a successful result in Glasgow at COP26. Now I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome up a similar, but not the same, panel to assess where we actually got to in those two frenetic weeks at the end of October, early November, that culminated in the Glasgow Pact, some very interesting initiatives in terms of coalitions being launched, but also ended with COP President Alok Sharma, in some ways the hero of the COP, clearly frustrated that there was a change to the key wording at the end of the day, which appeared to be at the behest of China and India. So to chew over where we are, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Andy Jordan, Professor of Environmental Policy at the University of East Anglia, Professor Elizabeth Bomberg. Elizabeth is joining us from the University of Edinburgh, where she's the Professor of Environmental Politics and Policy. Bernice Lee from Chatham House, where she's Director of Sustainability and a Research Director on their Futures Programme. And last but absolutely not least, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined again from, I think, Delhi, by Professor Navroz Dubash at the Centre for Policy Research. So we're going to kick around. Please remember to post your questions in the Slido. And please upvote questions you like, and we will try and take those and we will fire them away at our panelists. So we are now, I hope, good to go. So let me kick off by the inevitable question, actually posted in the chat as well. Andy, you've written a blog for UK and a Changing Europe assessing COP26. So a question posed in the Q&A, but I was going to start that anyway. So should we judge COP26 to be a success, or did the UK waste its opportunity? Andy?
Well, I think that the first thing to remember about this COP was that it was a delivery COP. It wasn't a COP where new targets and objectives were anticipated to be set. It was about delivery, and that means generally checking that the parties to the UN Climate Change Convention, the main item of international law in this area, were delivering on their commitments and or were submitting new commitments. Generally speaking, I think that the UK administered the COP well. I think it did well in its presidency. Its presidency isn't finished yet. It runs until the end of the year. I suppose the key headline thing was, did we keep 1.5 degrees centigrade alive? And of course, that's impossible to answer on the basis of one COP. I think when people like Alok Sharma, the sort of hero of, as you said, of the COP, said that it was still on life support, essentially, I think what they were driving at was that, yes, some of the language around 1.5 degrees and some of the implications of trying to achieve 1.5 degrees were made more explicit in the agreement. But nonetheless, emissions are still rising and atmospheric concentrations are still rising. So there's still a huge amount of work still to be done in the forthcoming year and beyond into future COPs.
Navroz, do you think 1.5 is still alive as a result of the COP? Or are we, in a sense, fooling ourselves by pretending that we can actually get anywhere close to the sort of bending in the curve that would be necessitated to deliver that?
Well, thank you for having me back on this conversation, Jill. It was really fun the first time around, and I'm sure it will be this time as well. The answer to that question really depends on the metric one uses to decide whether 1.5 will stay alive. The metric we're using is whether once you plug in some numbers into a model, whether 1.5 is in the realm of possibility, and in the language of the modelers, is it 50% probable, 67% probable, and so on. I think, and that's then deemed to be the answer. The problem really is, how credible are those numbers? And that's not a modeling question. That's a political question. It's a question about delivery, as in the words that Andy put it, that this is the delivery COP. And that's not being factored into the discussion very much. So my understanding is that the rate of decarbonization of societies in order to get to 1.5 is extremely large and is a multiple of what the most rapid pace of decarbonization that has been achieved so far, which is probably the UK is among the most rapid decarbonizers. So basically we're saying that every country has to do better, or on average countries have to do better, 2 or 3 times better than the best country so far for us to reach 1.5 and sustain that pace. So that's a very big political lift. So 1.5 is only feasible if you take at face value these pledges off into the distant future. And the more distant the future, the less politicians are going to be held accountable for those pledges. So that's not a very hard pledge to give for 2050, 2060, 2070. So that's what worries me. I don't know if this is actually, if you look at it in political terms and in terms of delivery, whether 1.5 is alive. In terms of the modeling results, you're getting close. And I'm just not sure that's the right metric.
That's very interesting. Does anyone want to take issue with that assessment? Bernice.
I don't know whether I would never take issue with Navroz, as I enjoyed the last event as well so much. I think that, as Andy said, and I completely agree as well with both of them, that on one level it is probably too much to say that it is alive, but at the same time, if everything depends on tomorrow, this means that we still have a chance. And I'm going to resolutely try to go the half full route, especially because all the post-match analysis have come down on we are both half full and half empty at the same time. But I think that if we were to be optimistic after what happened in Glasgow, which frankly was a bit more positive than I personally expected, the results, we are unraveling a couple of very big problems that we know we have to solve, such as that politics of energy transition is and will be difficult, such as finance is and will be problematic, such as the trust deficit will and continue to be broadened. Knowing all of this, because we have a route back and more emphasis is placed on implementation and delivery, the fact that this is the emphasis tomorrow and today means that there is still a good chance that we could make it happen. Thank you.
Okay. Elizabeth, you could argue that the UK sort of lucked out by dint of the fact that the US president who came to the COP was President Biden. I assume President Trump would not have graced Glasgow with his presence in November had the COP been in the middle of the presidential election campaign last year. How does this look from the US? Did the US regard this as a big success? And how's actually the US's own commitments doing back home? We've talked a lot about translating this into delivery. Obviously, what the US can do back home, President Biden's ambitious plans really do matter for delivery as the second biggest emitter.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I definitely think the point that Navroz was making earlier about what are our criteria and our indicators and metric for success applies to this question as well, in terms of how do we assess the US's position and performance, and how is this viewed back in the US specifically. In terms of to look at the glass half full, all you would need to do is imagine what would happen if the COP had not been postponed and it had run in 2020 without Biden at the helm. And there you can see that this change of 1 year was absolutely dramatic, the change that can transform a country, and not just in terms of rhetoric, but in actual policies and initiatives, what can happen in 1 year. So I take hope from that, the idea that there has been a significant shift. Now, of course, it's absolutely true that the domestic constraints on the Biden administration are absolutely fierce. And it would have helped Biden and Kerry and the whole US delegation tremendously if, as hoped, some of the congressional acts that are still making their way through the Senate, some of the infrastructure bill is through, but the Build Back Better bill, this is the one that has all the really good climate stuff that is still stuck in the Senate and is still touch and go because of really perhaps one senator. So Biden was not able to come with that full force, boy, are we back and we have something, and this is a credible stance that we're back. He couldn't do that, but they were still able to show, not just compared to a Trump administration, they were still able to show that the US matters and that the US can play a role on its own, but also crucially, something we could talk about later, in the extent to which it works, collaborates and builds blocks and initiatives with others.
That's really interesting. I want to review the sort of performance of some of the key players at the COP. Navroz, one of the early announcements at the COP was the announcement by India of a net zero target, but for 2070, which I think got some focus. There's lots of interpretation about what did this really mean India was going to do over the next decade, the decade that the COP was really focusing on. And was this actually huge progress that India had finally signed up? Or was this really far too modest and suggested that things were badly off track? How should we interpret President Modi's announcement, Prime Minister Modi's announcement?
Right. Well, before I get to India, just if I could have a small postscript on the conversation we were just having. I broadly agree with the glass half full assessment of Glasgow, mostly because we closed the loop on, or the negotiators closed the loop on several procedural things of great importance. Article 6 on markets, the transparency, and so on and so forth, created a process for adaptation. So I think these were broadly positives. I guess I'm just not sure whether that was sufficient to get us to 1.5 and whether that should indeed even be the benchmark for success. And just the last word on this, there's an assumption that if you push for 1.5, you have a higher chance of getting to 2 degrees. And that I am not sure of, because when you put so much pressure on political systems, you might actually, it may actually overstress the political system. So I just leave that as a question. Is it a given that if you push for 1.5, at best, at worst, you'll just get to 2 faster? I just leave that as a question.
That's a brilliant question. I'm going to come back to that. So let's just advise everybody that you're going to be asked to answer that question there. But India.
So India, in the build-up to the COP, India came under a lot of pressure. There were visits every week by Mr. Sharma, Mr. Kerry, Secretary Kerry, others. And it was clear that the narrative of keeping 1.5 alive, you couldn't even do the modeling answer to that if the world's 3rd or 4th largest emitter, depending on how you count, at 6% of emissions, wasn't providing you a long-term target. So it was almost a mechanical thing that we had to have a number from India, any number, And so my own sense is that we did what India often does, which is apply the China plus 10 rule. So China said 2060, we said 2070. And I say that partly tongue-in-cheek, but partly it's actually true that, India is at least a decade behind China. And so if we add on a decade, we give ourselves some breathing room. Now, is that ambitious or not? Again, the deeper question is, we do not have a global framework for discussing what is ambitious and what is fair. I think it's certainly the case that those who said, look, we need to get to net zero by 2050 to have a prayer of 2 degrees or 1.5. Therefore, 2070 is 20 years too late. That is wildly wrong. Because in fact, there is no reason why every country needs to get to net zero by 2050. In the history of the negotiations, not just for political reasons, but also for technical reasons in terms of the fact that India's emissions are going to be growing. We're starting from a very low base of energy use, and at least for the next decade, some of the enhanced energy use has to come from fossil fuels. And so the nature of that transition is just more complex in a country that's going through the kinds of transitions India is going through. And so 2070 was probably fair game. The issue I would actually say is, if you really want to know whether India was doing something useful and ambitious, look at what they said for 2030. And that was actually a mixed bag and a bit fuzzy. And that's where I think India actually missed a trick. Lots on renewable energy, not much else on other things. But the 2030 pledges are what we should really be looking at to evaluate India, not the 2070 pledge.
So is that a thing that you would expect to see pressure on India to the 2030 pledges to revisit before next year's COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where we did get that language, didn't we, in the final agreement, that urging leaders to have a look again at their NDCs, at what they've committed to do?
Well, it's very hard to crystal ball gaze on this, but I will say this. The political mood in the last week or two, and partly because of the coal issue, which I guess we will get to, has turned very sour. The Prime Minister made a speech 2 days ago on Constitution Day, the passing of our Constitution, using the phrase multiple times, carbon colonialism, right? Very powerful stuff coming from a PM. And essentially the story was this. We were really taken to the mat and said, net zero, pretty please net zero. We gave a net zero target. We nonetheless ended up being the bad boys of the process for language that China and the US had agreed to. No real money emerged from this process. Nothing happened on adaptation. So India gave a huge amount politically and ended up being the fall guy. So why exactly do we come back to the table in a cooperative mood? That seems to be the question people are asking.
That's very interesting. Bernice, I think last time we asked you to interpret for us where China was in the process. And I wondered, President Xi didn't come to Glasgow, very notably, debates about whether that was a specific boycott or just that he wasn't traveling since COVID, and nothing too much to be read into it. But there were hints throughout, would China move? And until the sort of end in this initiative with the US, we didn't see any substantive movement on targets from China. So how's the position at the end of the day looking from a Chinese perspective?
I think, again, as I said last time, not in the business of tea leaves reading, but at the same time, I think that a couple of things, really. One is that it is notable that China did not really up its stake in some ways. It did not raise its ambition. I also think that it is becoming quite clear that the G2 relationship is important to China, in the sense that that was where they chose to move forward together with the US. And at the same time, I think not very subtly, but throughout the COP process in the first week, and certainly throughout, even after the US-China joint declaration, China was very subtly and not very subtly positioning itself, not, a little bit away. I think my internet is unstable, it says. I'm sorry if it is. It says that it is sort of positioning itself away from the politics of ambition and target setting towards implementation and delivery. So I kind of thought that there was a very interesting positioning that China started to make, certainly becoming very obvious towards the second week, but even in the first week, that while you're fighting about ambition, let me say that I'm focusing on the business of delivery. Now, there are good and bad things about that. The good thing is that delivery is clearly important. The bad thing is that I think that ambition and target setting are also important, and we are not done yet. And this is where I have a slightly different view from Navroz. I understand the political difficulty, and I agree with the political difficulty, and everybody has the same political difficulty around the world. But at the same time, the positioning that delivery and getting on with the business of implementation is really the message that we are now hearing from China. Now, what does that mean for this year? Now, if it really is getting on the business of delivery, especially for the 2031, that will be great. So you were seeing a couple of things being announced subsequent to COP, including, I think just a couple of days ago or yesterday, the discussions around investment in green projects in Africa. That was part of the president's announcements. There were announcements around how the People's Bank of China is looking at green project financing and new credit lines being extended, etc., for green projects in China. So I think that, and then there are also new announcements for domestic targets for, I think, peaking around steel and peaking around for cement as well. So again, I mean, look, again, glass half full, glass empty. Obviously, we all know that how important targets can be, especially in a political system like China, in driving delivery. So important, especially when it's about delivery in the near term. So I think that we still need both in order for that to happen. So it was an important sideshow, I think, for the larger business of COP, but at the same time, having the two major powers throwing mud at each other in the first week wasn't helpful for the dynamics and the politics. But at the same time, that said, there's no question that they provided cover for each other, in the sense that the US obviously got cover from China on its low delivery on finance, while China got some cover from the US when it comes to its not coming forward with a new targets and stuff. So there's no question that they were providing cover for each other. And on Navroz's point, the last point, which is that it is indeed true that not just India, but China also took a lot of flack for the language adjustment at the end of watering down the language. When, I mean, one could argue, and I am one of them who would argue that, I mean, while I understand the perceived significance of the changes in language, but the reality is that without an actual end date, phase out versus phase down is, arguably, the important is having a date for the phase out, not necessarily just whether the language itself. And whether or not just China hiding behind others, or in this case, Navroz mentioned China hiding behind India, but I think that US, Australia, Japan are all hiding behind China and India taking the fall for the language change at the end, when their domestic conditions are also not necessarily ready for the kind of phase out that a language was proposing. So it's US, Australia, Japan, among others, who probably were also pretty happily hiding behind China and India taking the fall for the last.
Very, very interesting of various people hiding behind others to get away with lower commitments. Andy, one of the sort of comments after the COP in terms of the major players was that the EU had been rather absent from the COP, maybe not played the big role that might have been expected. We had the finals of G2 announced between the US and China. Might one even dare to suggest that the EU was rather hamstrung by the fact that it couldn't call on the UK anymore and was suffering a bit of a post-Brexit hangover here in terms of negotiations? The UK used to be quite a big force in climate negotiations in the EU, or are there other reasons why? Was it that indeed a fair critique of the EU's showing this time around?
I think the EU did a lot to get its ducks in a row before the meeting. So it's adopted a legislative target. It's tabled, but certainly not passed, a huge package of legislation, Fit for 55. It also pushed very strongly some of these initiatives outside the main framework of the UNFCCC, like on methane, for example, and also push very strongly for the states within the Framework Convention to look slightly earlier at some of these post-2020 NDCs. So on the whole, I think the EU did okay. I think it was certainly in that sort of huddle right at the end, the huddle involving, China, India, and the US. So it was absolutely there in the sort of final sort of denouement. I think the thing to watch now with the EU is a bit, as Bernice was saying, it's on the delivery side of things. So the big struggle the EU has now got is a bit like the US. It's now got to get this huge package of legislation through the Parliament and through the Council. And that's when we'll see splits, I think, begin to appear. I mean, they're already appearing. I mean, Poland is reluctant on phasing out coal. The Germans want to protect their car industry. The French are worried, who incidentally have the presidency next year, are very worried about a rerun of the Gilets jaunes backlash against higher fuel prices. So the EU has also got a big delivery problem as well. I think it's somehow got to achieve in the next 10 years the same scale of emission reductions that it's achieved in the last sort of 30 years of EU climate policy making. So a big challenge lies ahead.
Interesting. So the UK government set itself sort of 4 big objectives, which Allegra Stratton, the COP spokesperson, used to sum up as coal, cash, trees and cars. I just wanted to quickly review where everybody thought we'd got to on coal, cash, trees and cars. Navroz, last time when we spoke, you had talked a lot about the failure to mobilize climate finance, and we saw that as a repeated complaint from the global south, and that assessment that the commitments wouldn't be delivered in any case till 2023, I think. Did you come out of the COP with a feeling that finally the developed world had got its act together on cash?
I think it's hard to answer that in the affirmative, honestly, Jill. I mean, the fact remains that I think it was Elizabeth who used the phrase, or maybe Bernice, trust deficit and so on, right? 2023 as the date when a pledge that was meant to be met by 2020 is supposed to be redeemed for a number, $100 billion, that is actually far less than most people estimate is needed. Doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence. A lot has been made of the fact that the Glasgow Pact called for a doubling of adaptation finance. Well, yes, but from a low base of $20 billion, which take you up to $40 billion, UNEP estimates we need $70 billion today and rapidly rising to hundreds of billions. So it doesn't inspire a great deal of confidence. What I think is happening in the world of finance has always been one of these kind of shadow games, right? And how much can the West show up, pony up just to kind of keep the conversation going in a sense? And how much can at least the large developing countries use it as a way of saying, well, if you don't show us the cash, why should we do a great deal given that we have differentiated responsibilities? So it's that kind of shadow game that has persisted. What I thought was most interesting about Glasgow was a perceptual shift, exemplified by South Africa's announcement that it had struck a deal to basically get a bunch of countries to collectively to pony up $8.5 billion to support a just transition away from coal in South Africa. And in India, there were some reports of India talking to the World Bank directly about an even larger sum aimed at supporting a soft landing on coal. I think we're going to see these more kind of multivariate financing packages that go beyond public money funneled through the GCF or the Green Climate Fund, bringing in the multilateral development banks. There was also a side discussion, this proposal about dedicating certain portion of the IMF special drawing rights, which then get funneled into climate finance, a share of the carbon markets that would then go for loss and damage. So these kinds of more multivalent financing arrangements, as well as talk about, led by Mark Carney, mobilizing the private markets to direct money towards climate change. That, I think, is more practical and realistic. It doesn't get you away from kind of the principled argument that developing countries constantly make, which frankly, I'm not sure ultimately will result in that much more cash, which is you cause the problem, we have to bear the adaptation costs or make our development more costly, therefore you should bridge the additional finance. That's not going to actually lead to finance flowing. Some of these, I think the argument holds water, but I think some of the other multivalent routes are actually more pragmatic and hold out more possibility of real money crossing borders.
Elizabeth, I mean, the big telephone number on cash came on the Green Finance Day with Mark Carney's initiative and people sort of kicking around that $1 trillion of funding, I assume dollars, maybe sterling, it's not that different these days. But, should we be impressed by that? Was that, or quite a lot of people said, was this just a sort of bunch of greenwashing because people could sign up to be in Mark Carney's initiative without saying they were stopping funding fossil fuels and things like that. How important was that green finance initiative, do you think?
I think as a signal and as an indicator of where finance is most likely to come in the future, it was very important, because Navroz makes an excellent point that there has been a shift, and there will probably need to be an even greater shift away from this idea that states and states alone are the main vehicles and channels for funding. We've seen the COP, I would see this as one of the most disappointing aspects. It's what caused such anger, I think righteous anger, from many developing countries and from many of the protesters outside. The idea that any recognition, any real recognition of loss and damage, that there was no facility, that there was this kind of vague promise that we will have some dialogues in the future. So the idea of putting all your eggs in this one basket of trying to rely on states to deliver that funding, I think the finance discussions taking place that you mentioned, and also this huge increase in the presence of philanthropists, and the idea that we need to look at kind of multivariate sources. The other just parallel to that is it was quite remarkable to me to see how the host, Scotland, how the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, used this issue very cleverly. I thought this issue of loss and damage and climate finance, to say, oh, look, we're not a formal party, and we're not yet a nation, even though, wow, if only we were a state, look what we can do. But we're going to give a couple million to this loss and damage fund. Who will follow me? Will the UK government not? So that was a very effective way to play that moral high ground, but also send a signal to other countries and other actors that funding is absolutely, this is the grease that is needed to get this movement, and it just was not forthcoming at this COP.
Anya, I don't know whether you've got views on mobilisation of funds, but I also want to come on to whether the government succeeded in its objectives on cars, because that was thought to be another area where it didn't really make huge amounts of, or as much progress as it might have done, and some stories there about German car makers not coming as to the party as one might have expected.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know if Andy wants to come in there. With the cars, there was earlier, maybe kind of 6 months ago, when you were talking about G7, there was a hope that maybe one of the big announcements to come out of this COP would be the end, the total end of the internal combustion engine, or something somewhat dramatic that others could hang on to. And that didn't happen. But if you look at many of the domestic programs that are part of the country's national pledges in cars, and of course the shift to electric cars in particular is key, not least in the US. But I think Andy's point about German car makers is quite relevant here.
Andy, were we disappointed on cars?
I think what's interesting about all of these issues like finance and cars and coal is it illustrates the different areas of activity in Glasgow. So you had the sort of formal UNFCCC process. You then had the area of essentially climate clubs, like-minded states coming together and adopting things. And then you had this really vital and really sort of active area of civil society action. And so when you take an issue like coal, for example, you can see quite strong and ambitious language being developed within a small group of clubs, pushed very strongly by civil society action. But when you see the phraseology in the actual agreement itself, in the pact, it's been adapted somewhat to meet the unanimity requirements that prevail for all these areas within the UNFCCC. So yeah, of course, if you take an issue like cars, for example, yes, you get states like the UK who are leading, or France, for example, who are leading, who are very progressive and want to sign up to strong language. But then you look at the actual final agreement, and yes, it's not nearly as ambitious. Ditto finance and coal as well.
And so what should we look at? Should we actually say that the fact that, basically we're being dragged back by some laggards, or actually these sorts of, one of the features of the first week of the COP were these coalitions emerging, if you like, coalitions of the willing who wanted to go faster and make commitments, but not everybody, in some cases, and quite key players weren't part of those coalitions. Is this a good way of making progress? Because actually those laggards will come on board and they're not dragging back the level of ambition? Or is it a sign that actually, we're not going to get there? I don't know how should we interpret that sort of first week.
I think this is where
Andy,
sorry, just very quickly. I think this is where the sort of half glass half full perspective comes in. I mean, one of the key things that the COP did is it really emphasized the importance of staying not within 2 degrees but within 1.5 degrees. And it, in particular, noted the implication of doing that, which was to achieve a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. And the phrase it used there was rapid, deep, and sustained emission cuts. And I think now what we'll see happening in these different sub areas like coal production and coal burn and in the car industry as well, is we'll see the dynamics between the various players changing in light of that. And already within the car industry, we can see certain market pressures now beginning to feed through as different players sort of now make their investment decisions on the basis of the general commitment now to achieving 1.5 degrees. I think what the EU is now going to have to work out is precisely how quickly that happens, and if there are going to be opt-outs for certain countries or certain car producers, what they will look like. And that's the difficult work to be done in 2022 and through into 2023.
Bernice, what did you make of this sort of commitment by coalition rather than?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, we thought that Paris was about the why and the what, and then Glasgow should be about the how. But I actually think that through these side deals, the hows are going to become the what again. And so, again, I'm trying to put a positive interpretation in some ways, and I would very much follow the same vein that Andy just ended with, which is that the reason for that is because they are important signals for market creations. And in the end, I mean, we can always pick problems, but nonetheless, didn't think that fossil fuel financing could be agreed by the likes of Italy and the US before COP26, for example. There were sort of significant enough progress made by enough numbers of the market leaders in some of the areas. And by the way, I was just remembering that when we did the last one, some of the post-match analysis for G7 suggested that it wasn't actually Germany, but it was the US who didn't want the cast language to be in, if I remember correctly at the time. Because at the time, the rumor was a certain country, but ended up to be someone else. But I guess the point remains that if the importance of COPs are about making sure that the signals on the wall are clearer, and I think that one could make the argument that certainly in terms of the direction of travel, there are clear market signals or clearer market signals than before, even if we don't have everybody just yet. But at the same time, it is hard to imagine that the road back is diesel and others at this point. However much is a question of how fast we get to the other side. So I kind of feel that through these deals, actually, we ended up having inverted house back into the what. So I would be imagining it would be impossible for the next COP not to be looking at language around fossil energy, for example, or coal. Imagine for this to be undone from now on. So in some sense, it has set a new kind of bar. And yes, not fast enough, not quick enough, not big enough, but at the same time, we are at the beginning of the market signaling and market creation process again. And just one last thing, if I may, I mean, Michael Jacobs was reminding me, and I think he's absolutely right, in Glasgow, that even the COP that was seen to be a failure, which was Copenhagen, and even if we didn't call them NDCs at the time, all the national country plans at the time with all the renewable energy commitments at the time, ended up helping create the renewable revolution that we see today, alongside many other factors such as trade and manufacturing in China, etc. But nonetheless, the point is that even what was seen often as a failure, such as Copenhagen, actually ended up sending the right sort of market signals on renewable energy, because every single country have plans in them. So I very much hope that we could look at some of these side deals or plurilaterals as the beginning of some of the market signaling. That would mean that as we make forward-looking plans, they could be as included, notwithstanding all the challenges that Navroz and Elizabeth and Andy reminded us earlier in terms of domestic political strife, and obviously the pushback that we're hearing, especially when it comes to some of the developing economies coming out quite strongly using colonialism language around carbon, for example, that we are seeing quite a bit since COP26. Thanks.
I want to come on to accountability, which is one of the big themes that's emerging from the questions. Thanks everybody who's posting a question. What else things about, it's quite easy to go to a big summit to make quite an ambitious pledge, but as you've all stressed, what really matters is delivery. I think there was some quite technical agreements at the COP about completing the Paris rule book and transparency. I'm not sure whether that links into some of this accountability discussion, but maybe one of you could pick that up. But how do you think the sort of accountability mechanisms work here? In the UK, we have our climate change committee overseeing government progress. That's a domestic thing. Climate change committee can publish its assessment saying the UK is on track or off track. But is there any sort of global equivalent to hold people accountable for what they do? That's a question from quite a lot of people here. What's accountability feel like? Elizabeth, do we see accountability? The US is notably usually quite reluctant to be held accountable by anyone else for what it does, balks at extraterritoriality.
Yeah, indeed. So a couple of remarks. One is, of course, with no global government, there's no global monitoring. There is no global accountability, formally speaking. So the accountability takes a kind of proxy form, suboptimal form, but it's what we've got. One could be seen as a success from COP26, which is making much more robust the rules on transparency in terms of the pledges and how they will be met, and transparency definitely in terms of some of the rules around carbon trading and carbon offset that Andy mentioned. Okay, accountability for delivery, which is, again, this is where we are. It's actually not about the pledges anymore. It is about the delivery. We've all made that point. So the accountability for the delivery needs to come from out with the UN and the UN structures. And this is where the role of, yes, domestic government, domestic constraints, Jill, that you mentioned, but it's also where I would like to direct our attention again back to those outside the COP. We've never seen mobilization from so many civil society groups all at one time, youth groups and women's groups and labor groups and church groups and faith groups. That gives me hope for accountability, because I think that's going to be one of the most instruments or channels of accountability. And what I would like to see is also accountability from the media. The problem with the COPs is that they're once a year or once every 2 years, and we get, especially this time, we get hordes of media attention. There's never been such a presence of media. And then the COP is over and they all go home. what we need is that same scrutiny, media scrutiny, mobilization from outside, demonstrations. We need roundtables like this. We need these not just around the COP, and that's where our accountability is more likely to come from.
Navroz, how does accountability feel in India, and what difference does the completion of the Paris rulebook make? I mean, will we now get much more like-for-like reporting, much more transparency? Can you explain to a non-expert why this mattered? Because certainly a lot of the negotiators thought going in that this would be one of the really important things to deliver from this COP.
Right. I haven't followed the transparency sort of into the minutiae, but my understanding is a couple of things were decided. It turns out to be a surprisingly prosaic discussion. You know, what sorts of units do you use? What do your reporting tables look like? Are people reporting the same kinds of things, and do they understand the same concept from the label at the top of the Excel column? You know, so those are actually fundamental things to make sure that we are actually having the same conversation, and I think that's very important. What came out of Glasgow, I understand, is that the reporting requirements for developed and developing countries grew ever closer together, which I think actually is a positive. I see no reason why developed countries should report with any less stringency, especially if their emissions are large, with the caveat that the argument that's always been used is that if you have low capacity, you might end up straining the capacity of a particularly a small country that could better be used for other things. So there's some exceptions made for that, but broadly, countries are brought on the same page, and I think that's very important. Now, I think we tend to think about transparency as a way of, as you put it, as a way of holding to account. But, you know, I'm not sure, other than what Elizabeth suggested with sort of outside actors holding nations to account, there's no really robust compliance mechanism. You know, it's not like there's a direct sense of what the consequences will be. And I think we often miss another aspect of transparency. So the Glasgow COP and the source of the ambition cycle is seen to be naming and shaming. I think that sort of went substantially out of the window with Mr. Trump and Bolsonaro, and either the floor for shaming just became so low that it's not a very effective mechanism. But there is another mechanism that I think is very powerful, which is that transparency and these procedural hoops, like putting together NDCs, provides space for domestic actors to shift their domestic politics. So when you have transparency and you have a process, you know, every think tank in India was running around holding webinars, doing modeling studies, and I'm sure that's true of most other countries. And so bureaucratic meetings are convened, interministerial conferences are held, and ferment happens. And it happens in a structured way because of transparency. So I actually think that's what's really interesting about the transparency framework. Let me just make one more quick point. Some work that a few of us collectively have done looked at whether or not most countries have institutions. We've heard a lot about the Climate Change Committee. Most countries don't have anything analogous. So when you have a future target, you don't have a machinery to translate that future target into present action. It really devalues the use of that target, and the more abstract that target, the less valuable it is. So a target around renewable energy or around public transport density in cities is potentially very useful, but a net zero 30, 40, 50 year out target without that institutional mechanism is of less value. So there's kind of an institutions and transparency kind of linkage there that is unexplored at the national level.
It's really interesting. Bernice, how does accountability sort of work in China? Obviously, it doesn't have to depend on quite the same sort of democratic accountability. Obviously, doesn't face the same sort of democratic barriers to action that governments in the West might be worried about. But do you think that we can be relatively confident that pledges will finally turn into delivery? Is there a sufficient accountability?
It's interesting. I was just thinking about what Navroz and Elizabeth just said just now. And indeed, I mean, some of the most egregious loopholes internationally have been trying to be closed through Glasgow. And indeed, that now we can compare apples to apples. whereas before it's certainly a case of apples and oranges. And what I thought was interesting as well in the run up to the US-China joint declaration, the sort of political class, I think Todd Stern, who was the special envoy before, and others, were all sort of emphasizing, interestingly, I thought, that even if China did not come up with the kind of targets that the rest of the world is asking it to make, what you could be sure is that they would deliver what they have committed. And it is partly, and I thought that was quite interesting, it is the sort of faith in the delivery expressed by Todd Stern at the time in terms of the ability of the system to deliver. And I think it's partly because democracies tend to look at more centralized, government systems, let's just say, as having some of the ability to deliver in a way that they felt that perhaps they couldn't. At the same time, what is important to note beyond perception is the fact that it is true that once these targets are translated into implementation policies and strategies, there are obviously reporting processes in the Chinese political system for them to be reported back to the central government via not least the 5-year plan process and others. And indeed, there have been designs of rewards and systems for local officials, which is not just based on delivery around growth, but also around delivery of environmental targets. Now, so as to whether or not that is comparable system, I think clearly these political systems are indeed at the moment apples and oranges. But at the same time, there are different types of accountabilities. And indeed, I think I got some questions while I was in Glasgow from journalists a lot about civil society in China too, which may not look like civil society here in terms of the way it expresses its opinion and activism. But at the same time, there are many different non-governmental groups working as well on mobilizing stronger environmental and climate action in countries like China and beyond. And also, obviously, what ultimately keep each other accountable isn't just internal, but also external pressure, but also not just from large, rich countries, but also from peer countries and other developing countries. So I think that we have a much better understanding following COP26 really around the different types of, as I think was Navroz who mentioned, the sort of the shaming bar has been set low, but at the same time, somewhere between shame and flattery, which is ultimately some of the most important diplomatic toolkit that we do have. Perhaps if we don't look to just the usual suspects of actors, but looked at a broader set of actors. And I mean, very importantly, ultimately, one of the reasons why we have the Glasgow Pact was largely because everyone chose to listen to the vulnerable countries who have expressly suggested towards the end of the negotiation process that they would prefer to have an outcome than not. And I think that is a new kind of accountability and moral accountability that the system has incorporated. And I think by and large as well, talking about the split between the streets and the room, ultimately what we did see right at the end of COP26 is that some of the more positive dynamics from the streets actually fed back into the dynamics within the room, unlike what was feared at sort of halfway through the negotiation point. So I'm suggesting that your question is clearly complex, and I'm trying to give a less, yes and no answer. And there are different types of accountability mechanism. And maybe most importantly, I feel, coming out of COP26, because the Secretary General also suggested that he will have an expert group looking at the net zero integrity question for the private sector, which is obviously a very important piece of the puzzle as well. Now, we're all pointing to the expert group of the Secretary General to help answer some of the more challenging questions that will help bridge the gap in the private and the public as well, and between all the commitments of the G funds and money and the delivery point, because a lot of the delivery has to happen also not just by the public sector, but the private sector too. So I guess the new goalpost has become the way to look at indeed different ways of accountability mechanisms functioning through different types of shame and flattery and peer pressure and monitoring and evaluation and transparency in such a way that get us to a more multifaceted understanding of accountability, because obviously without a world government, we don't have the kind of Leviathan type of dynamic that a lot of the times I feel these questions are comparing ourselves against, which we are bound not to have the right answer, because clearly we don't have a world government and we don't have that kind of supposed hard accountability mechanism that we all dream about, but yet at the same time have to rely on a much more multifaceted cobweb of accountability mechanisms for this to work. Thanks.
So we've been mainly looking back, but I want to use the last few minutes just to throw forward to next year. Next year, COP27 is also going to be a significant COP because quite a lot of unfinished business from this COP has been thrown there, not least people looking again at their commitments. Andy, the UK is COP president until Sharm el-Sheikh, but obviously we'll have to work closely with the Egyptian presidency to be. But what needs to happen? What does it need to do between now and next year to make that COP, if you like, fill in some of the gaps still left after Glasgow?
Yeah, that's right. The UK continues with its presidency right through to the end of next year. So I think there will be some formal tasks that will need to be taken forward. You know, the rolling out of Article 6 on carbon markets, working on finance and generating finance and agreement around the use of finance, and also, again, beginning to think about what the NDCs after 2020 might look like. But I think this sort of work's, I guess, going to take place without the sort of media spotlight focused on it. So that might make progress easier. It might actually make it harder. I mean, two things to bear in mind. First of all, there are some really important IPCC reports coming out next year. One on impacts, Working Group 2, and another one on policy responses, Working Group 3. Those, as they come out, will help to focus attention on why we're pursuing decarbonisation. That it avoids some really significant impacts if we get it right. And secondly, it might actually generate some really significant co-benefits as well, in terms of reduced energy insecurity and local air pollution and things like that. And secondly, I think it's going to put even more focus on the UK's domestic delivery of its pretty ambitious climate commitments. And that's going to require, I think, action in areas that haven't so far been touched so heavily by policy. Agriculture, for example, housing, domestic heating, things like that. You know, the things that go under the sort of title of behaviour change, which, politicians don't really tend to like if they can avoid it.
Very quick question. Will it make any difference having the Greens in government in Germany, which has the presidency of the G7 next year? Do we expect to see anything coming out of that?
Well, I think yes, the coalition agreements or the outlines of it are now out. I think in general, it's aligned in general with EU policy commitments. I think where we might begin to see differences emerge are where the sort of now the common German position begins to run up against the French position. I mean, just to give one example, the Germans seem quite interested in rolling the emissions trading system, a market-based instrument, out into areas like transport. The French, for understandable historical reasons, are much less keen on that. So that's definitely something to watch.
Okay, Navroz, what needs to happen between now and Sharm el-Sheikh?
Well, keeping in mind that this is going to be a developing country COP, as it were, hosted by a developing country, I think the possibility for this trust deficit to spiral, or this is going to be a severe test of whether that trust deficit is going to be bridged or not in the interim period. And I think there are probably two or three things that need to happen. One is developed countries really have to show up with much more being accomplished at home in terms of short-term action between now and 2030, because this idea of kind of opening up the development space for developing countries, we need to see some kind of vacating of that space, sort of a down payment at least towards that. What we've also seen in the UNEP gap reports and other places is a lot of countries are backloading their pledges. And when you backload your pledges, you're actually not opening up that space, right? You have to front load your pledges. In other words, you have to do more now than you have to do later. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is money on the table in concrete ways, whether it is the old-fashioned, take it out of taxpayer dollars or sterling and put it in GCF, or some of these other avenues we've talked about, whether that is credible. And then the third thing is more concrete mechanisms, and particularly something serious around loss and damage, I would say, rather than another talk fest. I think these are going to be very important things, and failing that, I think there are many large emerging countries like Brazil and South Africa that are sort of, well down the way of domestic pledges. But there is a substantial rump group that is kind of tacking back hard to the sort of equity first narrative, which says the more we're asked to do, the more it becomes a zero-sum game of dividing up the carbon pie. And that voice was palpably stronger in Glasgow and will be stronger yet in Sharm el-Sheikh if this trust deficit isn't met.
That's really interesting. Bernice, what do you think needs to happen to make Sharm el-Sheikh a success?
So I think that all the unfinished questions that Navroz and others mentioned we have to have an answer. I mean, for example, what is the answer to the legal quagmire that the US will find itself in with loss and damage? But what is an answer to the question? Even we understand that there is the fundamental philosophical challenge around it for the US government, for example. That's one. Second one is that I think that, the UK, I thought, did a very interesting creation, the Ministerial Roundtable. And I thought that there is a chance for the UK to sort of talk about using the Ministerial Roundtable as a way to drive some of the 2030 targets setting and delivery questions. So I'm interested in seeing whether or not it is possible and plausible for the UK presidency in the remaining 11 months to help institutionalize the Ministerial Roundtable as part of the COP, so that it provides a different kind of avenue and ways to drive some of the discussions, so that it provides a different type of focal point. And certainly, I mean, last but not least, I mean, it is already heating up, the discussion, but with the discussion around overseas fossil fuel financing and obviously challenges around development in Africa, among others, other developing country regions. And certainly we're already seeing this heating up around gas, the role of gas and gas financing. And I would only assume that it would get increasingly heated, the discussion between now and COP27. So the promoting the deal of the sort that we're talking about with South Africa is one, but nonetheless, another definitely one such a very important one as well. At the same time, it is also important that we are also looking at scaling out green financing in such a way that also deal with some of the questions that will come from stakeholders in Africa around gas financing that we're already seeing being heated up as we speak, and will only likely to get more and more heated between now and COP27. Thanks.
Final word, Elizabeth. Sharm el-Sheikh, I'm not sure it's timing vis-a-vis the US midterms, but current trajectories, it looks like the Democrats could suffer some setbacks there.
Yes.
Will Glasgow mark the high watermark of US climate diplomacy? Will Biden and Kerry stick at it? What do you expect them to do in the run-up to COP27
yes.
to make success?
That's an excellent point. It's going to be navigating the it's going to be almost squaring a circle. If the message in the US, which is to me the proper message, if that Building Back Better and the green agenda actually helps precisely those who need the most help in the US, then success at COP links back to success for the Democrats at home and vice versa. So it's about whether the Democrats can make that link tighter and stronger. But I also I just want to remind everyone to go out on a positive note that something really significant to me in COP27 is that this is already going to be another ratcheting up. After Paris, the ratcheting up is only supposed to be every 5 years. And the countries at Glasgow did agree, no, that is way too long. So at our very next COP in a year's time, we're going to do this all again. So there will be pressure to see if some of those pledges and some of those domestic initiatives that are needed to meet those pledges, we're going to be able to check those or to hold people accountable in much sooner than we had hoped. And so that might be the way to get the UK president to put pressure on those other countries, which it can do if it uses the remaining presidency to its full ability.
Thank you. I'm going to stop there. That was excellent to end on an optimistic note. And I think actually this is a relatively optimistic assessment. A lot of glasses half full rather than half empty, which is always a good place. Notwithstanding the comments about keeping up the scrutiny and the accountability, I'm going to now invite all our experts back to another preview of how we're getting on towards COP27 sometime in the middle of next year, because that was a really fascinating discussion. So on your behalf, can I thank them? And on their behalf, can I thank you for posting your questions, which I hope we touched on, even if not as explicitly as you might want to. So thank you very much, and apologies for running 5 minutes over. So thank you all very much. And there will be a video of this on our YouTube channel, so do remind all your friends to watch. Thank you all very much.